Just after 5 a.m. on July 9, 2009, 67-year-old Bud Billings poured some cereal into a bowl and then passed it to his 11-year-old daughter. Then he grabbed another empty bowl, filled that one with cereal too, and passed it to his 10-year-old son. This was Bud's favorite part of the day. It was like a cereal assembly line that he did with his kids every morning while blaring country music from a nearby stereo. It was really the only way to get breakfast on the table, because Bud had a huge family. He and his 43-year-old wife, Melanie, had 9 children, all under the age of 11 years old, who lived in the house with them. And all of them had special needs. Now, it hadn't always been that way, though. Bud and Melanie had gotten married 16 years earlier, and at the time, they'd had Bud's adopted son, Justin, and Melanie's 2 girls, Ashley and Nikki. And at that time, it was actually just Nikki who had special needs, and she required a lot of extra care. She had autism, cerebral palsy, and epilepsy. And unfortunately, just last year, she had died from a stroke, which had been completely devastating for the whole family. But, looking after her and caring for Nikki had really made Bud and Melanie want to take care of other kids with special needs too. Which was why, about 10 years ago, they had actually intentionally begun adopting children like Nikki. And once they started doing that, they felt so fulfilled and so happy about it that it had been really hard to stop. Bud looked over to where the rest of his kids were gathered around the table eating cereal. And it seemed like a lot, and sometimes it felt like a lot, but Bud loved his big, chaotic family and was really proud he was able to give these kids a home. And he made a good living as an entrepreneur and business owner, to the point where he'd actually been able to build this entire huge house for his kids. It had 9 bedrooms, so everybody could spread out and have their own space. And outside, they had a big fenced-in area with a whole setup, a slide, a swing, big trampoline. Now, the home was technically on the highway, but the driveway was so long, they couldn't even hear the cars. Plus, the town of Beulah, Florida, where they lived, was really remote anyway, and there weren't a lot of people around to even be driving on the highway. All that's to say, this big old house on the highway felt more like their own personal little fortress, especially when you consider the fact that Bud had an extensive surveillance system. He had a bunch of cameras inside and around the property to keep an eye on all the kids and make sure everybody was accounted for. And so Bud filled up the last cereal bowl and went over to the table, where his wife, Melanie, was busy breaking up a fight between their 2 youngest. Bud watched her very calmly end the argument without ever raising her voice, which was sort of typical of Mel. She was the most patient person he had ever met. As Bud sat down at the table, the phone rang, and Melanie got up to get it. Bud could hear the happiness in his wife's voice as she answered, so he guessed it had to be Ashley. Melanie's oldest daughter, Ashley, was 26 now, but she still called home at least a few times a day. Which, Bud didn't mind, but it did sort of make him a bit jealous. He wished he was as close with his older son, Justin, as his wife was with Ashley. He'd adopted Justin when he was just a baby, and he was 20 now, and so he'd basically had him his whole life. But for some reason, Justin, ever since dropping out of college last winter, really didn't seem interested in spending any time with his dad. Bud guessed it was just because he was embarrassed, or maybe there were some growing pains that came with adulthood, but it was still tough to feel that distance with his son. Just then, Melanie suddenly handed Bud the phone and told him that Ashley had a question for him, and Bud could guess what this was about. He owned an auto business and financing center, and Ashley had taken it over a few years ago so that Bud could slow down and spend more time with the kids. But he still helped her with problems as they came up. So Bud took the phone and asked her what was up, and sure enough, it was an issue about the business. And so Bud listened carefully as she described some billing issue that he did have an easy fix for, and then after they were done, they hung up and they both went about their day. Later that day, around 4 p.m., Bud went upstairs to his home office. The summer heat had finally broken, so he had spent most of the day outside with his kids. But their 37-year-old neighbor, April Spencer, was now downstairs helping Melanie out with all the kids, which meant Bud could finally break away and go get some work done. Even though Bud was basically retired, he'd been an entrepreneur all his life, and it felt sort of unnatural to completely stop working. So he'd sort of started a side hustle, financing used car lots. He also invested in other businesses, but he was picky about who he got involved with. Recently, he was approached about investing in a local karate company, but he had to back out because he wasn't really sure it could be profitable. Plus, the owner, Patrick Gonzalez, was friends with a man whose name was Cab Tice, and Bud hated Cab Tice. Now, Bud was a nice guy with a very clear soft spot for kids, but when it came to business, he never let people get the best of him. And Cab Tice had tried. Bud and Cab used to be partners, but then Cab had stolen a bunch of money from Bud. And the way Bud had handled it was to basically confront Cab almost every day, calling him all the time and demanding he pay him back. And so, on this particular afternoon, Bud decided he would call Cab again and demand his money again. So he dialed Cab's number, and he let it ring until it went to voicemail, which was not a surprise because Cab really never answered. Bud decided not to leave a message. Instead, he just hung up and made a few more calls to some associates at his car lots. It was around 5 p.m. when Bud went back downstairs to find his wife Melanie and his neighbor April in the kitchen, making some mac and cheese for the kids' dinner. April actually lived on their property in a trailer and was basically part of their family. Melanie and Bud had known her for 10 years at this point. She was also a registered nurse, so she was a huge help with their kids, who all basically had health issues. When Bud got down there, he thanked April and told her she could head back home now. He was ready to step back in. So they all said their goodbyes, and then the next 2 hours were just a blur of bath time and bedtime. Then it was lights out for the kids right at 7 p.m. Once the kids were in bed, Melanie went to clean up the kitchen, while Bud settled down in the living room and turned on the TV. And as he sank into the couch, he let himself feel the exhaustion of the day. He loved his life, and he was ready to do this all over again tomorrow. But still, he was tired. As Bud sat there on the couch, he began to doze off. However, his eyes shot right back open again when he heard a loud bang come from the front door. Instinctively, he leapt up, having no idea what was happening, but all he could hear were these loud, pounding footsteps charging through the house, headed straight towards him. 20 minutes later, around 7:30 p.m., Bud and Melanie's neighbor, April Spencer, made dinner in her trailer and got ready to relax for the night. And she'd just taken a plate out of her microwave when she heard a child's voice outside yelling. April was more confused than alarmed. I mean, it was typical to hear the kids next door, but usually, at this point, they were all in bed, asleep. And then before she could investigate, someone started banging on her trailer door and screaming for help. April rushed over and swung it open to see the Billings' 11-year-old daughter standing on her trailer steps, sobbing. She then mumbled through panicked tears that something bad had happened in her house. Seconds later, April sprinted towards the Billings home, which was only a short distance from her trailer. And when she got there, the front door was already open. She hurried inside to find the house very still and quiet, except for the sound of someone sobbing upstairs. She could tell it was one of the kids, and immediately she called up to them that everything was okay, she was here. But then April saw something that made her stop mid-sentence. On the floor of the hallway, just outside the living room, was a trail of blood. April gasped and started to panic when she realized the trail led to Bud and Melanie's first-floor bedroom, but she forced herself to slowly follow the blood and push open that bedroom door. And when she saw what was inside, she had to bite her lip to keep from screaming. She staggered backwards away from the room, then ran to call 911. Within the hour, at least 6 police units and a team of crime technicians were at the Billings' home, documenting the horrific scene and collecting evidence. Deputy Robert Guy climbed out of his cruiser in front of the house. So far, he'd been told that the homeowners, Bud and Melanie Billings, had been found shot to death inside of their bedroom. And before even stepping 1 foot inside of this house, Guy already had a theory. So he had been with the Escambia County Sheriff's Department for 6 years, and in his experience, when a couple was found dead at their home, it was always a murder-suicide. But even if that was what happened here, Guy had never worked a case like this before, because he'd also been told that 9 young children lived inside of this home, and they were actually in the house during this shooting. They had all been found hiding around the house during the initial police sweep, and they were now standing outside by a police cruiser wrapped up in blankets. There was an adult woman standing with them, and Guy could see that all of them, the woman included, were either sobbing or staring off into space, clearly in shock. Guy felt this wave of sympathy come over him. These kids were too young to go through something like this, and so the more time he could give them to process, the better. So instead of speaking to them first and forcing them to sort of confront what had just happened, he decided his first move would just be to go into the crime scene and have a look around. Guy headed towards the house and entered through the front door. And the first thing he noticed was there was a big boot print on the wood of the door, and the sides of the door were all splintered. This door clearly had been kicked open. And so seeing that told Guy that his murder-suicide theory likely couldn't be true. Someone else had forced their way into this home and committed this crime. Guy asked a tech to take a photo of the door. Then he went inside to do an initial walkthrough of the first floor. There was some blood in the front hallway, and even more of it soaked into the living room carpet, where there was also a bullet hole in the floor. So at least part of this attack must have happened here. Guy then headed to the primary bedroom where he'd been told the bodies were. And the first thing he noticed in there was that there was a lot of blood soaking into the carpet, and there were also a bunch of shell casings on the ground. Bud's body lay at the foot of the bed face down, and when Guy approached, he could see that Bud had been shot multiple times, including at least once in the head, and he also had a zip tie on his left wrist, and so clearly at some point, the killer must have tried to restrain him. Melanie was by the closet on her back, and also she had gunshot wounds in her head and chest, and she did not have any restraints on, and so she had either cooperated with the killer or was just shot first. After looking at Melanie, Guy's eyes moved over to the closet right nearby, and it was wide open, and he saw inside the closet there was a very clear square impression in the carpet on the floor. It looked like something very big and heavy had been removed from that spot, possibly by the killer. And so this gave Guy a new theory. If something had been stolen from this room, that suggested this was a robbery, and maybe Melanie and Bud had just gotten in the way. So Guy left the bedroom to do a full walkthrough of the whole house, including the upstairs, with this theory in mind. However, he didn't actually see anything else that pointed to a looting or a robbery. Big-ticket electronics and jewelry were still in the house, and so was a safe that was upstairs, which of course could mean his new theory that this was a robbery was wrong. Or it could mean this was a robbery, but the robber had only been looking for something specific that they knew was in this house. Like, for example, whatever that heavy square object was that had been at some point sitting in the closet in the bedroom that left that impression in the carpet. He really wanted to know what had been in there. So he figured now was the time to go outside and actually speak to the kids. Moments later, Guy was standing with the Billings kids and the woman who was standing with them. The woman said her name was April, and that she was the one who called 911. As April spoke to Guy, she kept glancing over his shoulder at the kids to make sure they were okay. And Guy did too, because even though he wanted to speak to these kids, he knew he had to tread very carefully. Not only were these kids likely very traumatized, but anytime law enforcement interviewed young kids, it had to be done with precautions like with a specialist or trusted adult. So for right now, he was just starting with April. Her voice shook as she explained how one of the Billings' daughters had come to her trailer and then also what she had actually seen when she went inside their home. April said she lived on the property, but she hadn't seen or heard anything strange before going over there. April also told Guy that she looked after the Billings kids a lot, and that they actually had two other older kids, Ashley and Justin, who did not live in the house with them. And so she gave Guy their numbers and said somebody was going to have to call them and let them know what happened. Guy immediately headed over to some officers and asked one of them to get in touch with Ashley and Justin, not only just to notify them, because that was obviously necessary, but also because these two likely could have critical information about this case. And in a domestic murder like this one, loved ones were always the first people Guy looked at as potential suspects. Just then, Guy turned and saw a flash of headlights coming down the driveway, and soon a car pulled up and a young couple jumped out. The woman was frantic and headed right for the kids. When some officers tried to stop her, she shouted that her name was Ashley and those were her siblings. Guy rushed over, and she said again to him who she was, and also that the man she was with was her husband, whose name was Blue. Then she breathlessly explained why she was there. She called the home earlier, and the kids answered, screaming that Mom and Dad were shot. She had been the one who told them to go to April's. She had also called her brother, Justin, who was on his way too. But she said she still didn't know. Were her parents okay? Had they really been shot? As gently as he could, Guy told her what happened, and he watched as Ashley collapsed in Blue's arms. A few minutes later, after Ashley had hugged the kids and calmed down enough to speak, Guy pulled her aside to ask her a few questions. She was still having a hard time catching her breath by this point, but she managed to explain their family situation. Melanie was her mom, and Bud was Justin's dad, and the other kids were their adopted siblings who were adopted by Melanie and Bud. And so Guy let Ashley talk about her parents and her siblings for a few minutes, and then at some point, he asked her the question that had been bothering him. Did Melanie or Bud keep anything valuable in their bedroom closet? Ashley looked confused, and then said, her parents had a safe in there, but inside of it was just documents and some sentimental pieces of jewelry, nothing financially valuable. She said they did have another safe that was upstairs, and that one had a lot of cash in it, maybe around like $200,000. Guy hurried to write this down, and as he did, it just didn't make any sense to him that this killer potentially had taken a safe from the first floor that had nothing valuable inside of it, but then left the safe upstairs that potentially was full of money. But Guy wasn't really confused, it was more like he was excited, because now he was thinking the killer must have inadvertently taken the wrong safe. And so if this was true, it meant that whoever did this knew enough about this family to know that Bud and Melanie did have a safe. But the killer apparently didn't know enough to know that there were actually two safes in the house, one with money and one without. So, very likely this meant the killer was, somewhat close to the family, but not that close. Which made it unlikely that Ashley and her husband Blue, Ashley's brother Justin, and even April the neighbor were suspects. However, before Guy was going to eliminate anyone, he really needed to speak to the kids. So he asked Ashley if she would help him do that. About a half an hour later, Guy watched as Ashley and Blue coordinated with April to bring the kids away from the scene over to Ashley and Blue's place. By this point, neighbors had gathered outside and everybody was just standing there watching the scene in total shock. It had proven to be very difficult speaking to the kids because they were kids and they were terrified and many of them had disabilities, which also made it difficult for them to speak. However, during his conversation with the kids, Guy had been able to learn one huge thing. One of the girls happened to look out the window right before the murders and saw a red car parked outside. Now, she wasn't able to give Guy much of a description of this car other than the color and that it was a bigger car, like an SUV. But a large red car was distinct, and Guy had already asked some officers to put out a message to patrols to keep an eye out for it. He also had officers speaking to the neighbors, but the Billings lived on a pretty remote patch of land, so he doubted anybody had seen or heard anything because they just lived too far away. And so Guy had just decided to wrap things up for the night when he saw another set of headlights appear from down the driveway. Seconds later, a car pulled up and a young man got out, and then he hurried toward the house. An officer stopped him, and Guy could see that at that point the man began to look around and then jogged over to Ashley and the kids. Ashley gave this young man a big hug, and then she began to cry into his shoulder. Guy guessed this young man had to be Justin, Bud's older son, who Ashley had said would be coming. But even though he was only a few feet away, Guy thought there was just something off about him. He didn't appear to be shocked or even really upset at all. He's just arrived at a crime scene where his parents had been shot to death and he seemed sort of unfazed. But actually, less than being unfazed, it was more like he was sort of nervous. He kept furtively looking over at the police and then the home and sort of fidgeting a little bit. Now, like Ashley, Justin was very likely quite familiar with this house, and also the location of the safes and what was in them, and certainly might not have needed to force entry if he was going to come in here and rob the place. But Guy just had a feeling that something was up, and so he went to speak to him. And as he took the few steps over to Justin, Guy saw Ashley suddenly push herself away from Justin with what appeared to be a very urgent look on her face. When Guy reached the group, Ashley was just shaking her head almost incredulously, saying out loud that she couldn't believe she hadn't thought of that. Then Justin turned to Guy and said, "Has anybody checked the cameras?" Guy froze and asked what he was talking about. Justin told him that their father had cameras in basically every room, and he knew where the recordings were kept. Guy couldn't believe that nobody had noticed these cameras all around the property this whole time. But regardless, if they were there and were as extensive as Justin claimed they were, this was huge. And also, offering up this information suddenly made Justin's behavior seem a whole lot less suspicious. If Justin was on those cameras, he certainly wouldn't have mentioned them. But Guy still wanted to interview him at some point in a more controlled environment to get a better read on things. So, before he ran off to tell the crime techs about these cameras and the tapes, he asked Justin if he would come to the station tomorrow, and Justin agreed. Around 8 p.m. the following day, Guy was sitting in his office staring at his desk phone. And he was feeling really antsy because his case had taken a huge turn in the last few hours. And now he was waiting on a call that he hoped would be the first step in wrapping this thing up. He still didn't have the surveillance footage, which would take a while. There were 16 cameras located on the property, and crime techs were still going through all the tapes. They also hadn't found any fingerprints at the crime scene either. However, they had used the bullets and the shell casings from the scene to figure out that the murder weapon, the gun that was used to kill Melanie and Bud, was a 9mm. It was information Guy could later use to connect to suspects. Guy had interviewed Justin earlier that day, and even though the 20-year-old had still acted way too casual for someone whose parents had just been violently murdered, Guy didn't think he was actually a solid suspect. For one, there was no motive. Even though Justin admitted that he and his dad were not on great terms at this point, he didn't seem angry with his dad. He also had an alibi. He was at his friend Greg's house for dinner that night, and Guy had confirmed it. And Justin knew about the two safes and which one was more valuable, just like Ashley had. But what Justin had given Guy was a suspect, a man named Cab Tice. Cab used to be Bud's partner, but then he apparently stole from Bud's business, and Justin said he had actually seen his dad and Cab arguing over this money, and how Cab still had not paid Bud back. And so if Bud had any enemies, Cab was very likely one of them. It had taken all day, but Guy had finally tracked down Cab at his used car lot in a town that was located about 20 miles away from the crime scene. And since this lot was actually in a different county, Guy had to ask some deputies from that precinct to go over there and see if Cab was actually there. And so now Guy was just waiting for their call. And a few minutes later, he finally got it. One of the deputies rang him up and said they were at Cab's, and Guy would never believe what they found him doing in the back of the parking lot. He was cleaning out a red SUV. Within the hour, the deputies brought Cab to the station. Now, they couldn't bring the red SUV in or even search it because Cab had not given permission. So Guy would have to see what he could learn from Cab himself. And as soon as Guy sat down across the table from Cab, he instantly knew, Cab Tice was the kind of guy who always had an answer for everything, like the red car. Cab said he was cleaning it because he was going to sell it tomorrow, which sounded way too convenient. But Guy let it slide. And instead, he asked about Cab's relationship with Bud. And to Guy's surprise, Cab launched into a tirade. He said he hated Bud. Everybody did. Because Bud nickel and dimed everybody he did business with, even though he was rich. And it was common knowledge he literally carried around a briefcase full of money, like 20 grand, whenever he was doing business deals. And so Cab told Guy about all these people Bud had screwed over, like him and his friend Patrick, who had been relying on Bud to invest in that karate company before Bud apparently pulled out over profitability. And then at some point, Cab said if he was being honest, Bud probably deserved to get murdered. Guy couldn't believe what he was hearing. I mean, Cab had just admitted to despising a murder victim, and also he admitted to knowing that this same murder victim kept cash in his house. So the next thing he asked Cab for was an alibi. But Cab had an answer for that too. He said he was over at this other used car lot meeting about a potential business deal, and he said that lot was about an hour and a half away from the Billings' home, and he gave Guy the number for the people he had been with when he was over there so Guy could call and confirm it. And Guy just got up and left the room to do just that. And like Cab said, his business partners confirmed he really was there during the time Melanie and Bud were killed. And so when Guy hung up the phone, he was frustrated. He had felt sure that Cab had to be involved, but there just was not enough evidence to keep him here. So Guy headed back towards the interrogation room to tell Cab he could go home, but before he got there, he noticed one of his detectives running down the hallway towards him. And when he got to Guy, the detective told him that after looking through hours and hours of footage from the Billings' house, they had found something that Guy needed to see. Late on July 10th, over 24 hours after Bud and Melanie Billings were murdered, Guy and another detective sat in front of a TV in silence, watching footage from the Billings' home surveillance system. The shot they were looking at was from an outdoor camera, and it showed a red vehicle pulling up to the home around 7 p.m. Now, the license plates were covered, but Guy could tell this vehicle was not the same one Cab Tice was caught cleaning. The vehicles were both red, but this, in the video, was a passenger van, not an SUV like the one Cab had. And so this, along with Cab's alibi, meant they had virtually no evidence that Cab was the killer. But Guy quickly forgot about Cab, because what he saw next on this video shocked him. 5 people wearing all black, gloves, masks, and carrying guns jumped out of the red van. They immediately split up and without hesitation ran to different points outside of the home. And then the footage inside the house showed these intruders entering from 3 places: a bedroom slider door and a back utility door, both of which must have been unlocked because none of those were forced open, and then of course the front door, which was kicked in. They all stormed into the living room where Bud was watching TV and where Melanie soon appeared. There was no sound, but Guy could see them talk to Bud before one of them shot the floor. After that, some of them zip-tied Bud's wrists, and then the one who fired at the floor then shot Bud in each of his legs. And then after that, they dragged the couple down the hallway to what Guy assumed was the bedroom, where they disappeared. And unfortunately, there were not any cameras in the bedroom. Shortly after that, Guy saw on some outdoor footage the 5 intruders reappearing, leaving the house now with a safe, and then they drove away in the van. The whole thing happened in less than 10 minutes, and they were only in the home for maybe 4 minutes. After watching this footage, Guy just leaned back in his chair, feeling completely stunned. All along, he'd been thinking this was a robbery gone wrong, but what he had just watched seemed more like a military raid. It involved what appeared to be a sort of ruthless precision that seemed out of proportion for this small-town family home. But now, Guy knew he must be missing something crucial about the Billings' family. It could be that maybe Bud was involved in some kind of criminal enterprise, and the extreme security at his home was to protect the family from his various shady associates. If that was the case, it was more likely this was some kind of hired hit done by professionals, and the safe was just stolen to cover up what really happened. And if that was true, it changed Guy's entire case and basically made all of his suspects viable again. Cab's alibi was now worthless. The fact that he was not physically at the crime scene didn't matter, because maybe he hired a hitman. Similarly, just because Justin and Ashley knew which safe had money didn't matter either, because again, they could have hired hitmen to do this. But now, in order to narrow it down, Guy, of course, needed to find the killers, the supposed hitmen. And since he now had an actual image of the killer's red van, he decided he would release it to the public in case anybody in the area had seen it. The next morning, Guy was at his desk drinking some coffee. He just released the image of the red van to the public, and now he was just waiting for local tips to come in. In the meantime, he'd also been looking into other areas of Bud and Melanie's life to see if there was anything that explained the apparent trained team of assassins that stormed their home. And he found out that Bud used to work in the strip club scene, and he was known as a local investor for businesses in the area. But Guy didn't see how any of that connected to the murders yet. And all of his initial suspects, who he'd just put back on the table, were off of it again. He'd learned that Cab Tice was basically homeless and living at the used car lots that he worked at, which certainly gave him a motive for robbing and killing Bud, but no means. Because if Cab was broke, it was unlikely he could have afforded one hitman, let alone 5 well-trained hitmen. And then as for Ashley and Justin, even if, that safe had been stolen as a decoy, to show that it couldn't have been them because, they knew where the money was, well, there was still no clear motivation for either of them wanting their parents dead. Guy knew that Ashley had taken over operations for Bud's business, and so, perhaps she wanted the whole business to herself. But with her parents' death, it meant that she, sort of by default, would become in charge of her 9 siblings, which was going to be a lot of work and stress, and so Guy wasn't really sure that that trade-off made any sense. As for Justin, he just didn't seem like he had enough anger to want Bud or Melanie dead. Plus, he was the one that literally pointed out to Guy that there were cameras all over the house. and so it was doubtful he would send hitmen to a home he knew was littered with surveillance cameras, only to tip the police off to go look at the camera footage. But just then, an officer poked his head into Guy's office and told him that a woman had just called the tip line, and she believed she had actually seen that red van in her neighbor's backyard. An hour later, Guy, along with another detective, stood in the backyard of a home in Pensacola, Florida, located about 15 miles away from the Billings' home. This house belonged to the neighbors of that woman who had called their tip line. Basically, they were at the house where presumably this red van was located. A couple lived at this house together, but right now, only a woman was home, and she gave the detectives permission to go look around the property. And sure enough, in the back, the detectives found a red passenger van parked behind a shed. The van was missing its license plate, and also there were all these patches of black spray paint all over it, like somebody had been trying to alter its appearance. At some point, the other detective wandered away from the van and began walking around, and then a minute later, he yelled to Guy to come over and look at something. And so Guy jogged over, and he saw there was this burned out fire pit right in the backyard, and when Guy looked inside of it, his jaw dropped. At the bottom, in the ashes, was a pile of partially burned black clothes, just like the kind of outfits that the killers were wearing in the footage. Guy turned to look at the home they were standing behind. At this point, Guy knew they had to get that van towed, and they had to bring the couple who owned this place in for questioning, because that couple either knew who killed the Billings or they had done it themselves. It would be a few hours before Guy finally spoke to the husband of the woman who had let them into the backyard. And when he did, that man told him everything. Based on multiple confessions and surveillance footage, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Bud and Melanie Billings on the evening of July 9th, 2009. Around 7 p.m., the killers stormed into the Billings' home. As they did, they could hear their 4 other hired accomplices running through the house as well from where they had entered, and the killer knew they would all congregate in the living room as planned. They had all practiced for this moment for a month, so everybody knew exactly what to do and what their role was. They were ready, and their execution would be flawless. So the killer ran into the living room, and by the time they got there, their other accomplices had arrived there too. And so the team of 5 swarmed Bud, who had been watching TV, and they also grabbed Melanie as she ran into the room screaming. The killer then struck Bud and demanded to know where he kept his money. But Bud said he didn't have any, which the killer knew was a lie. Because it was practically common knowledge that Bud kept a lot of money in his home. That was why Bud had so much security and lived in the middle of nowhere to protect his money. And so the killer was not going to let Bud lie his way out of this. And so they pulled out their gun and fired a warning shot right into the floor. That way Bud and Melanie knew they were serious. Bud flinched, but when the killer asked the same question about the money, Bud still said he didn't have any. And that's when the killer became enraged. They coldly ordered their accomplices to tie Bud up. And then once he was, the killer walked over and shot Bud in the leg. And even though Bud began screaming and so did Melanie, the killer, calm as can be, just asked their question again. Where is the money? But amazingly, again, Bud gave the same reply. And so the killer aimed his gun at Bud's other leg and shot that one too. At this point, Bud and Melanie are screaming at the top of their lungs, and the killer and their accomplices just grab Bud and Melanie and begin dragging them down the hallway towards the bedroom. And when they got into the bedroom, the killer smiled, because the closet door in the bedroom was open, and they could clearly see there was a safe sitting inside. And so the killer told their accomplices to go get some duffel bags ready. They were about to get their cash. And so once the accomplices were gone to get their bags, the killer was alone with Bud and Melanie. And they turned to Bud, who by this point was writhing in pain but quiet, and they asked Bud to open the safe. But through gritted teeth, Bud claimed there was no money inside of it, which made the killer even more furious. How could Bud still keep lying? And so the killer, without even thinking, put their gun right up against Bud's face and shot him through the cheek. Bud fell to the ground, shocked by the blow, but still very much alive. But the killer walked over they aimed their gun at Bud and fired several more times. Melanie began screaming right behind them, and so the killer turned and demanded that she open the safe. And when she didn't either, the killer shot her multiple times as well. When the killer's accomplices returned, they knew they were going to be shocked to see Bud and Melanie dead. This was not part of the plan, and the killer was anxious too. They really had not expected this to happen. But the killer thought, you know what, it doesn't matter. We don't need Bud and Melanie. They could just take the safe and break it open later. So together, the accomplices and the killer hauled the heavy safe out of the home and into the waiting van. 10 minutes after they'd arrived, the killer and their accomplices drove back down the Billings' long driveway, eventually returning to their father's home, where they parked the van out back and burned all the clothes that they had worn during the attack. Finally, after all that, the killer went home. And as they were driving, they thought about the safe that they had stolen, and how relieved they were that finally they had some money for their business. It would turn out the person who organized the robbery and eventual murder of Bud and Melanie was one of Bud's former business associates, Patrick Gonzalez. Patrick owned a karate company, and at one point he had tried to get Bud to be an investor. And initially, Bud seemed interested. And for a moment, Patrick felt like all his financial problems were about to go away because here comes Bud with all his cash. But then Bud backed out, citing, lack of profitability. And after that, the karate business failed. And so suddenly, Patrick was desperate for cash and simultaneously feeling very burned by Bud. And like everyone who did business with Bud, they assumed that Bud was very rich. Patrick knew Bud had a huge house, and also he had this state-of-the-art security system, sort of reinforcing the idea that, behind the walls of this home, there was great wealth. In reality, the reason Bud had a big house and had the security system was just for his kids. He'd worked hard to build them this big, safe house. But to Patrick, he was convinced Bud had potentially millions of dollars stored in that home, and he was going to get it. So, before the murders, Patrick asked his father, Leonard Gonzalez, and a group of men he knew from working at a mechanic shop to help him rob the Billings. And under Patrick's guidance, using his self-defense knowledge, the group trained for a month to pull off what they thought would be a very smooth, efficient heist. Killing the Billings was never a part of the plan. It was just about taking the money that Patrick had convinced them all was going to be in this house. However, Patrick had become enraged once he had confronted Bud and felt like Bud was lying to him and further, insulting him, and so he had killed the couple. And so after Guy and his team found the van at Patrick's father's house, police brought the father, Leonard, in for questioning, and very quickly, he turned his son in. Patrick Gonzalez was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death. As for his father, Leonard Gonzalez, he received 2 17-and-a-half-year sentences, and the other accomplices involved in the attack got between 22 years and life. While this is just speculation, it's believed that the reason Bud and Melanie did not give up the code to that safe is because they knew in doing that, the killer and the accomplices would see there really was no cash in there, and they wouldn't stop until they searched the whole house and found their cash. And they knew that their cash was actually located upstairs in the second safe where their children were. And so very likely, Bud and Melanie essentially died, ensuring that these intruders never went upstairs and so did not harm their kids. As for the 9 kids, they were raised by Ashley and her husband Blue, who eventually moved into the Billings' home. On August 4th, 2019, a 28-year-old man named Sombora left his farm in rural Cambodia and headed off into the jungle. His goal that day was to climb the nearby Chakrai Mountain and try to harvest as much bat guano as possible. So bat guano is bat poop, and it makes excellent fertilizer. And in the jungles of Cambodia, there are all these mountains, including Chakrai Mountain, that have these cave systems full of bats, so it's a great place to go looking for bat guano. And Sum and his family, they would go out there and harvest as much as they could in order to support their farm. This is kind of like their main business. And so on this particular day, Sum was not just going to climb this mountain and go into random caves and hope for the best. Today, his mission was to go to one cave in particular that he knew had a ton of bat guano inside of it,
mostly because the other people in the area that went out harvesting bat guano, they wouldn't go into this cave. And the reason for that is the cave was really, really narrow and tight and frankly dangerous because of it, and so they didn't go into it. But Sum was a very slight guy with a narrow frame, and so he could basically get himself into tight spaces and reap the benefits of places like this cave. And so after hiking for about an hour through the jungle and then up this mountain, Sum finally reached the entrance to this particular cave. And it was an opening that was about 3 feet by 3 feet, and you really couldn't see very far into it. But Sum knew what he was doing, and pretty much immediately got down on his stomach. He got his flashlight out, he took his guano bag, which had a long strap coming off of it so he could drag it behind him, and he began wriggling his way into this opening. Now, the way this cave system roughly worked is there was this narrow entrance that went kind of straight ahead like a tunnel, but then periodically, as it continued along, there'd be these kind of like pockets, these openings where it would get big enough where Sum could actually get up onto his hands and knees and kind of move around a little bit. And it was inside of these pockets, these caverns, where all the bats would be. And that's where most of their poop was. And so all Sum was trying to do as soon as he went inside this cave is get to these caverns and then do his harvesting. And so Sum, he wriggled his way forward, he got through that first tunnel section, and he entered the first cavern, and sure enough, there were quite a few bats on the ceiling, and there was all this bat guano, about a pound of bat guano. And so he scooped it all up, he put it into his bag, and then he kept on moving through the tunnel into the next cavern. And as he was making his way down that second stretch of tunnel, shining his light ahead, he saw what looked like the walls moving up ahead when he was looking into the next cavern. But he knew that was not actually the wall moving, there was a whole bunch of bats in this next cavern. And so from his perspective, it seemed like there were way more bats in that cavern than this one. And so in theory, this next cavern was going to have a ton of bat guano, potentially all he would need for this entire journey. He could just pack his bag and leave after this next cavern. However, there was a small problem. Now, Sum had come to this spot many times before, and he knew that going from the first cavern to the next cavern had a little bit of a hiccup. On the ground, as you crossed the threshold into this second cavern, was a crack in the ground that basically ran perpendicular to the way this tunnel ran. Now, the crack was only about 6 inches wide, but when you were over it shining a light down into this crack, it was like it went on forever. It was like this unending hole in the earth. And so Sum always just got creeped out climbing over this crack because there was really no way to go around it. You really had to go right over the top of it because all he was thinking about is like, what's down inside of this deep hole in this cave? It's reminiscent of how people are scared of really deep oceans like thalassophobia. It's fear of what's down there. And so Sum just really didn't like it. But again, he knew there was going to be a ton of bat poop if he could just cross over that crack, and so it was worth it. And so Sum, he wriggled his way through the tunnel, he reached the crack, he kind of shined his light down and again saw just this never-ending pit that just shot straight down into the earth. But Sum took a deep breath, he wriggled over the top of it successfully, and after he crossed it and he was about to enter into the cavern to get this huge bat guano payload, he felt something tugging on him, and immediately he was terrified and he whipped his head around wondering what could possibly be grabbing him. When he realized nothing was grabbing him, it was his guano bag that he dragged behind him with that big strap. It had gotten stuck on the crack itself. Sum was immediately relieved because he had really hyped up the idea that maybe there was some monster behind him or something, but there wasn't, and so he just kind of grabbed his strap and kind of jimmied the bag out of the crack. But as he did, he lost his flashlight. So he's moving the bag and he kind of fumbles the flashlight, and the flashlight rolled backwards into the crack. And as soon as this happens, Sum is watching with horror as he's seeing the light kind of jostling around as it tumbles down into the crack, but then it comes to a stop. Like it didn't just fall endlessly into the earth, it got wedged at some point, and the light from the flashlight was actually shining straight up. So it was pretty near the surface. And so Sum's thinking to himself, okay, that's bad, I can't lose my flashlight, I have to be able to see to get the bat poop and to get out of here. But let me just turn around and I'll reach into that horrible crack and I'll get my flashlight and everything will be okay. And so Sum carefully backed back down across the crack. And when he was looking straight down into the crack, he could see the flashlight and it was wedged, pointing straight up, maybe 1.5 feet or 2 feet down. Now, Sum did not want to reach his arm into this crack for all the reasons he was scared of the crack. Like, he doesn't know what's down there, but he really needs his flashlight. And so Sum kind of backed himself up and mentally prepared himself and then reached into the crack and began blindly reaching down, hoping to grab this flashlight and yank it out as fast as he could. But as he reached, he couldn't quite get to the flashlight. And so he began turning and twisting his body and forcing his shoulder deeper and deeper until finally he could touch the flashlight. And then finally, right as he grabbed the flashlight, something happened. That night, Sum did not return to his farm. Now, his family was not actually that worried about it because it was not uncommon for Sum to go out on these guano foraging adventures and be gone for, a couple days at a time. However, after another 2 days went by and still Sum had not returned, his family started to get worried. And so ultimately, Sum's brother decided to go out and look for him. Sum's brother had often collected guano with Sum in the past, and so he knew roughly where Sum liked to go, including Sum's favorite spot, that cave up in the mountain. And so when the brother went out looking for him, pretty quickly he found himself in that favorite spot. Now, Sum's brother was about the same size as Sum, and so he too could navigate this very tight tunnel. And so that's what he did. He got down on his stomach, he had his flashlight out, and he yelled into the cave for Sum, but there was no answer. And so he eventually made his way to that first cavern. He didn't find Sum, he kept going, and right as he was about to hit that second cavern, as he shined his light ahead, he saw there was a bag on the ground, and it was his brother's guano bag. And so he knew his brother had to have come here, and he began yelling out for his brother, but there was no answer. And then right as the brother paused for a second just to listen, he heard a faint cry, a human cry. And he called out like, "Is that you, Sum?" And again, he heard another cry. But he's looking around and he can't see Sum anywhere. And so the brother just continues shimmying his way towards that second cavern. And right as he begins to cross over that crack, he hears the cry again, and it's coming from right below him. It's coming from the crack. And the brother takes his flashlight and shines it straight down into that crack. And there, in the crack, was Sum. He was wedged all the way inside of the crack. It would turn out, a few days earlier, when Sum was in this cave reaching for his flashlight, he couldn't quite get his fingers around the flashlight. And so he kept turning his body more and more until his body was parallel with the crack itself. And then finally, right as he's leaning down and he gets his hands on the flashlight, he rolled and fell into the crack. His whole body basically perfectly fit into the crack, and down he went several feet where he wedged into the crack. And then once he was wedged down there was nowhere to go. He was absolutely trapped. And so Sum laid in this crack for days, having no expectation he was going to get out. He was totally wedged, no food, no water. He was going to die, and he knew it. In fact, he actively wished he had a knife on hand so he could take his own life. But luckily for Sum, his brother would find him, his brother would go and get help, and on the fourth day of Sum being trapped inside of this crack, rescuers were able to pull him out and he would make a full recovery.
The next and final story is called Last Wish. A little after 3 p.m. on March 22, 1959, a 20-year-old British college student named Neil Moss stood in a cavern about 1,000 feet underground in northern England. And as he stood there, he was staring with excitement into this dark hole right in front of him. The cavern that Neil was standing inside of was known as Peak Cavern, and it was one of the biggest and most twisting cave systems in the entire country. In fact, it was so big that at one point, an entire village of 30 rope makers lived inside of this cave. And then also, after those rope makers, the cave system became a hideout for criminals and thieves because there were so many secret passageways and basically places to hide inside of the system. So basically, Peak Cavern was a pretty famous place. And as a result, basically all of it had been mapped out or at least explored by scientists and spelunkers. Except for this hole right in front of Neil. It was an entrance to a tunnel that nobody even knew about. Neil and the amateur exploration group that he was a part of had discovered this entryway about 2 weeks earlier.
Now, neither Neil nor anybody else in this group had actually gone into this hole yet, and the reason for that was it was pretty dangerous. I mean, the opening to this tunnel was pretty small. It was 1.5 feet by 2 feet wide at the opening, and just looking down into it, I mean, it's a dark hole that you really can't tell how tight or how far it even goes. And so once you went inside of it, the deeper you got, the higher the risk of entrapment. And so whoever actually went into this hole really needed to be prepared. But Neil and the rest of his amateur exploration group really felt like it would be worth it to try to go down this tunnel. Not just because nobody had done it before, but specifically, they thought there was a chance that beyond this tunnel, basically deep underground, if you followed it long enough, it could lead to another big open chamber that nobody had found before. And those types of big open chambers, whoever finds them, gets it named after them. And so Neil and his group were thinking, hey, if we find this big chamber, it'll be named after us. We'll be famous, at least in, spelunking circles. But they also understood that there might be nothing at the other end of this tunnel. It could just be a dead end. But the only way to know for sure would be if one of the members of this group went into the hole. Now, in addition to a fear of being trapped in the hole, there were other big issues with blindly crawling into a tunnel no one's been in before. Like, for example, there could be a sudden drop-off, or running water, or some other hazard that whoever went into the hole wouldn't know about until they were facing it. And so naturally, everybody in this group was excited about the hole, but also a little apprehensive about being the guinea pig to actually go into the hole. And so after the group had kind of stood around the hole for a minute, kind of talking through who was going to do it, Neil had finally courageously volunteered to be the guinea pig. He would go down. And in many ways, Neil was kind of like the perfect candidate for this job. He was smart, he was strong, and most importantly, he was thin, which meant he could navigate a really tight space. The only drawback to Neil was he was pretty tall. He was over 6 feet. And generally speaking, the best cavers in the world are very short and thin because it allows them to get into the smallest, tightest spaces underground. And so Neil, who was standing over the hole, began to mentally prepare himself for what he was about to do. He pulled out his flashlight and he shined it straight down into this hole, which again is a pretty narrow hole, and it basically went straight down. And as he was shining it, he saw about 12 feet down, the hole kind of turned and you couldn't see what was beyond it. And so Neil knew the only part of this trip he would know about is that first 12 feet. Once he made that turn, everything beyond that was totally unknown. Literally no one in the world knew what was beyond it. But Neil was about to find out. The cave explorers anchored this 75-foot-long wire ladder that was all rolled up to this rock that was inside the cavern right near the opening to this hole. And once that was in place, they spooled out the ladder and kind of dumped it down into the hole. And so it fell 12 feet down and landed right where this tunnel turned and sort of went into oblivion where nobody knows what happened after that. And so Neil, his job was going to be to go into this hole feet first, go down 12 feet, and then with his feet, as he kind of blindly crawled backwards feet first into the tunnel, he'd be kicking with his feet this ladder, extending it farther and farther into this tunnel. The idea was this ladder was his way back out again. So he's basically on top of the ladder, making his way, and at any point he can just grab the ladder and climb back out again. And so once the ladder was in place and all the cave explorers were kind of waiting for Neil walked up to the edge of the hole, he took a deep breath, and then he swung one leg into the hole, placed it on one of the rungs of the ladder, put his other leg on the ladder as well, and kind of tested it to make sure the rock that was anchoring the ladder could hold his weight. Once he was sure it could, he said goodbye to the explorers and then began his descent, feet first, down into the hole. As Neil slowly and carefully climbed down this ladder during this first 12-foot section, he felt the walls of this hole closing in on him. When he was close to the bottom of this first section, the walls were literally flush with his shoulders and back. This was a really tight space. And so finally he got to the very bottom of this 12-foot section, and he was about to step onto what he thought was another rung, because he can't actually see where he's going. He's just using his feet to feel, and he stepped down and he felt something hard. It was the ground, so he had reached the bottom of the 12-foot section. He kind of tested the ground with his foot, seeing if it would support his weight, and after feeling confident, he stepped off the ladder and just stood at the bottom of the hole. At this point, Neil used his feet to kick the ladder that was still coiled up at the bottom of the hole into the next turn, into the next section of the tunnel that he'd be going down. And as soon as he kicked it, he heard it kind of spool out as it tumbled down this next section. However, it was not a straight drop like this first section was. This next section he'd be going into was more of a gradual decline, just based on the sound this ladder was making as it tumbled down. And so after the ladder had stopped making noise and he knew it had stopped, Neil gave one final look up at his friends above, gave them a little wave, even though he could barely move his hands because it's so tight around him, and then he got down on his stomach and feet first began shimmying himself down into this next section. Now, during the first 12 feet and during the initial turn into this new section, Neil had been able to turn his head and basically look down and see where his feet were going. But after only a few feet of going into this new section, the walls had become so tight on his body that he couldn't even move his head. He really was blind and had no idea where he was going. Now, for a lot of people, this would have been a claustrophobic nightmare. Neil is in this unbelievably tight space. He has no idea what's going to happen next. He doesn't know if it's going to get so tight he'll get wedged in there. It's cold, it's damp. I mean, it's pitch black in there. He does have a headlamp, but his head is like kind of pressed to the ground and he can't really move it. So, he's not really able to look around him. And periodically, as he was shimmying his way down deeper into this tunnel, he would dislodge rocks from the wall and he would hear them strike the wall as they tumbled down into oblivion. He had no idea if these rocks were tumbling into a dead end or if they were tumbling off a ledge somewhere, a ledge that he wouldn't be aware of until he got to it. But for Neil, this environment was something he thrived in. It was why he was so drawn to cave exploration. As much as cave exploring was a physical exercise and a physical test, it was much more a mental test. I mean, can you handle being in these tight spaces and persevering and continuing on when you're all by yourself and it's like dangers all around you? And also, Neil just loved being alone and in the dark. So cave exploration was like perfect for him. When Neil had made it about 10 feet down this new section, his feet touched the rolled up section of the ladder. And so with his toes, he kind of gave it a kick and the ladder tumbled for a second and he could hear it. And then it just kind of vanished altogether, like the ladder had gone over a cliff. And so Neil realized, very likely, just beyond his feet, even though he cannot see it, is a ledge, and very likely either a drop-off or a new cavern. The thing they hope is on the other end of this tunnel. And so this was exciting for Neil. He felt a rush of adrenaline. There's a new turn in the tunnel, and for all he knows, this is the cavern they're looking for. Or it's just another section of tunnel he would have to explore. But either way, he's making progress. And so Neil very carefully scooched backwards until he felt the edge, at which point he let his legs go over the edge, he found his footing on the ladder, and it was at this point when he kind of turned around a little bit that he could see this was not some big open cavern he had found, it was just a turn in the tunnel system. It was now going back to basically a vertical hole, big enough to fit inside of, but Neil has no idea how deep it goes or what it leads to. But Neil was totally undeterred. He lowered his whole body into the section, got on the ladder, and began descending. And very quickly, as he began this descent, the walls of this section, this new vertical section, were so tight, it was about 18 inches in diameter, that he actually couldn't just go straight down. His body didn't fit just trying to maneuver down. So the only way he could get himself to go down further was to shimmy himself side to side like a corkscrew, basically forcing his body deeper and deeper into this hole. And so Neil continued doing this for an additional 18 feet down in this new section of tunnel, which put him at a total of 40 feet down into this tunnel from the entrance where the rest of his friends were. And when he got down there, 18 feet down, he went to step onto the rung to continue his descent, but his foot hit rock. And he felt around with his feet, and he realized this tunnel did not lead to a big new chamber. It instead was a dead end after all. Now, just to be sure, Neil actually kicked as hard as he could. He's kind of restricted, but he kicked with his legs as much as he could to see if maybe this wasn't a true dead end. Maybe it was just an obstruction and he could clear it. But he could tell, after a few stomps, this was not moving. This really was the end. Now, part of Neil was disappointed because he was hoping that by doing this, they would discover this big new chamber and they'd get it named after them. But on the other hand, he was also relieved because by this point, it was extremely claustrophobic, even for a guy who thrived in this environment. By the bottom of this 40-foot section, he is completely wedged in place. And so Neil decided it was time to head back to the surface, but from where he was at, he couldn't even hear his friends. He's way down deep in this tunnel, it's totally pitch black. And so what he needed to do was just begin climbing back up this ladder. And then, about halfway up, he could call up to his friends and tell them, hey, I'm returning. But remember, to get to where Neil is, he has literally forced his body down into this tiny hole, basically corkscrewing himself as deep as he could get. And so he's totally restricted. And his arms are basically by his side, and his hands are basically pinned in front of his body. And so Neil tried to grab the ladder, which is literally pressed up against his chest, to begin the ascent. But even though his fingers could touch the rungs of the ladder, he couldn't actually move his arms to pull himself up the ladder. He could just hold the rung. That was it. But Neil had been in similar situations before, and what you do is you just use your legs. You drive with your legs and push your body up until your arms can go above your head, and then you continue the ascent. However, his legs also were basically in the same situation. It was so unbelievably tight around his legs that he couldn't lift his legs up. He could just basically wiggle his feet. Basically, there was no way physically for Neil to get himself out. He would need his team up above to pull him out. And so Neil began shouting as loud as he could, trying to get the attention of his friends up above, telling them, hey, I'm stuck, pull me out. And then also, as best as he could with his hands on the rung, he kind of pulled on the ladder, signaling to them like, hey, get me out of here. Now, he couldn't really hear anything up above. It was sort of muffled, and he couldn't tell if they were yelling back down to him. But as he was holding onto the ladder, he felt a little bit of tension, suggesting they were pulling on him. However, as he held on, waiting to be pulled up and out, he didn't budge. Like, despite the tension on this ladder clearly coming from the surface from his friends, he wasn't moving. And that's when Neil realized he had made a critical mistake. When he had reached the bottom of this tunnel, when he realized it was a dead end, he had stomped with his feet to confirm it really was a dead end. And when he had done that, he had inadvertently kicked the rungs of this ladder into a crevice, and then rocks, which he had heard kind of falling when he was kicking, landed on top of it, basically pinning the ladder in place. Basically, this ladder was now anchored inside the cave, which meant no matter how hard his friends on the surface pulled, they would not be able to pull the ladder up, which meant they couldn't pull Neil up. And Neil, once he realized this was the issue, he tried to move his feet to clear the rocks off the bottom of the ladder, but he couldn't. It was too tight around him. And so, Neil was totally stuck. The members of Neil's exploration group pretty much immediately realized this was a crisis, because not only was Neil stuck in this cave, but in these tight little tunnels underground, there's limited oxygen. So it's not just a matter of, we'll figure it out and get Neil out somehow. It's like, no, you have a limited amount of time before Neil runs out of oxygen down there. Even if you come up with a solution, it might be too late. And so immediately, members of the exploration group left Peak Cavern to go get help. And before long, over 200 people had flooded the cavern, including a mountain rescue unit and a coal mining extraction team and a whole bunch of civilians who were all there to try to figure out how to get Neil out. Now, at first, Neil was very optimistic about his recovery. He could hear clearly all the commotion 40 feet above him. He couldn't fully discern what was going on there, but he could clearly tell a major rescue operation was afoot. And so as ropes were cast down and ladders were cast down to try to get him out, and they continued to fail, and as the air he was breathing began to thin out and it was getting harder to breathe, Neil's reaction was to kind of be positive. He actually began cracking jokes and calling up like, hey, how much longer do I have to wait down here? But as the minutes turned into hours and none of the efforts by any of the rescuers were working, Neil began to panic. His heart was racing, not only from his nerves, but also because he was running out of oxygen. He had begun to grit his teeth really hard to kind of control his fear, but he was really starting to lose it. At one point, the rescuers threw down an oxygen mask for him to breathe because it was clear the air was becoming a real issue. But even though the mask literally tumbled down and hit him right on the head, so it's right here, he couldn't get his arms up to put the mask on. And so there it is, salvation, but he couldn't use it. And so before long, Neil sort of began drifting in and out of consciousness. One moment he'd be calling up to his rescuers, asking for an update. The next, they'd call down to him and get no response. Clearly, this situation was becoming dire. Now, to this point, the way the rescue had gone was the rescuers were basically throwing equipment into the hole, be it ladders or ropes or oxygen masks, for Neil to grab onto or put on him, and they were hoping that basically Neil could get himself out of the hole. Because the great fear was, if we send a rescuer, or rescuers plural, into this hole to get him, they could get stuck, and now we have an even bigger problem. But when Neil began losing consciousness, when they couldn't get him to call back to them, they knew they were genuinely running out of time. And so they began pumping oxygen into the hole to hopefully buy some extra time. And then they decided, we gotta send someone into the hole. Someone has to go in there, get Neil, and pull him out. And so one by one, these courageous rescuers went down into the hole, and 8 times they tried, and 8 times they failed. All 8 either got stuck along the way, or they passed out along the way. 3 people actually reached Neil and actually touched Neil, but there was no way to grab him and pull him out. And so Neil, who was conscious for a lot of this, like he's hearing and literally in some cases seeing rescue. It's right there, it's right in front of him, but it just didn't work. By the time the 8th man was pulled back out of the hole, they could hear in the hole this horrible sound, which was Neil gasping for air. Even though they were attempting to pump air into this hole, it wasn't enough, and Neil just couldn't fill his lungs with enough oxygen. And so the rescuers yelled into the hole for Neil to just hold on. They were gonna get him out of there, just be strong, hold on. But by this point, Neil, he wasn't even saying anything back. He just continued making these awful gasping sounds. By about 7 p.m., when Neil had been stuck in this hole for 4 hours, the rescuers decided to send one more guy into this hole, this really small civilian. And he went down there with a rope to attach around Neil and hopefully pull him out. And this little civilian managed to get all the way down, all the way to Neil. And when he found Neil, Neil was unconscious, but alive. And the rescuer put the rope around Neil's shoulders and then signaled to the surface to begin pulling. And so from the surface, they pulled on this rope, and slowly but surely, Neil began to be pulled out of the hole. And he moved about 18 inches, being monitored by the civilian who was down there. However, because they were pulling so hard on this rope to get Neil to move, the pressure from that rope was basically crushing Neil's chest, and he stopped breathing. And the civilian who was down there with Neil noticed it and yelled up to the group to stop, and they had to take the rope off because, yeah, they might be able to pull him out this way, but they would kill him. He would suffocate. And so once the civilian rescuer came out of the hole, he told the group, like, look, Neil's body is simply too big to be yanked out of the hole safely. He needs to be conscious and able to contort and twist his body, basically undoing what Neil did to get down there in order to get out again. Like, we need his participation, and he's unconscious, so we can't do that. And so at this point, the rescuers were totally desperate. You know, they know Neil is still alive. They can hear some of his ragged breathing coming out of the hole, but they knew they had to do something drastic right now or Neil was gonna die. And so they came up with this plan for this even smaller rescuer, this woman, to go down into the hole, get to Neil, and break his collarbone to try to shrink his body to be able to pull him out. And so this woman, she goes down there and she reaches Neil, but she failed to break his collarbone. And so she too had to come out of the hole, leaving Neil behind. And so once the woman came out of the hole, it became clear to the rescuers that Neil was not getting out of this hole, even though he was just 40 feet away and at this moment still very much alive. They could hear his ragged breathing, but there was just nothing anybody could do. And so one of the rescuers called Neil's father and told him, you need to come out to Peak Cavern. Not long after that, Neil's father, Eric Moss, arrived at Peak Cavern. Now, he knew going into this that his son was stuck. That's why he got the phone call to come out here. But he did not understand just how dire the situation really was. But as soon as he got to Peak Cavern and saw all these vehicles outside and the hundreds of rescuers coming in and out of the cave with these sad, dark expressions on their faces, Eric knew this was really bad. And so Eric made his way into Peak Cavern, and for hours, Eric just stood there in Peak Cavern, hoping to see his son emerge from the hole, hoping to come up and say everything is okay, but he didn't, and things only got worse. It eventually began to rain, and unfortunately, Peak Cavern, and specifically the hole that Neil was stuck inside of, flood when it rains. And so as rainwater is pouring into this cavern and Neil is still alive but stuck in this hole, they had to make the heart-wrenching decision in front of Neil's father to abandon the operation and get out of the cave, knowing Neil was going to die. Rescuers were finally able to get back into Peak Cavern at about 3 a.m. on March 24th, which is approximately 36 hours after Neil got trapped. By this point, the rains had subsided, the flood had cleared, and so they went in there hoping for a miracle. And when they got to the hole and listened into it, they actually heard Neil still breathing. He was still alive, but it was very clear he was at the end of his life. And all they could do was just sit around this hole and listen as Neil took his last few final ragged breaths. And then eventually they listened as Neil took his final breath and the hole went silent. Now, at this point, it was too dangerous to send anybody back down into this hole, and so no one could get physically close enough to Neil to actually confirm that he really is dead. However, after the hole remained silent for quite a while, a doctor who was on site did walk over and declare Neil dead. And so at this point, the rescue operation became a recovery operation. However, as rescuers were getting ready to go back down into the hole to retrieve Neil's body, it was at this point that Neil's father, Eric Moss, who had been there this whole time and had been witness to the doctor declaring his son dead, it was at this point that he stepped in and said, "Stop, get everybody out of the cave. I don't want anybody else to lose their lives." And so ultimately, Eric made the decision to leave his son's body where it was. Eventually, once it was 100% certain that Neil really must be dead at this point, they would fill in the hole that Neil had climbed down inside of with loose rocks from the cave, entombing him inside of it forever. And in his memory, the tunnel that Neil died inside of was named after him. It's called Moss Chamber.